And we now move on to Graeme Hawker. Dr. Graeme Hawker is a chartered science and a polymath. As a researcher at the Institute of Energy for Energy and Environment in the University of Strathclyde, his work focuses on complex modelling of renewable sources, with one eye on future market and regulatory systems and the other on new and changing technologies. Graeme possesses the closest thing we have to a crystal ball when it comes to future energy demand and generation. Today, with his modeller's hat on, Graeme is talking about predictably unpredictable and when simulation meets human nature, and why the human factor might throw a lot of energy cost modelling into disarray. Over to you, Graeme.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Pippa. I'm not sure of how much of that I'm going to be able to cover within 10 minutes, but I'll give it a good go. So as Pippa says, I'm an energy system modeler. I like taking some of these big decarbonisation problems and throwing lots and lots of data at it and seeing what comes out. But to begin with, I'll start perhaps by just doing an incredibly simple model of heat decarbonisation. So at the moment, we have a system that is very reliant on natural gas that may be displaced by hydrogen in the future, and lots of homes meeting their heat demand by using condensing gas boilers connected to those systems. So that's around 80% of current heat demand in the UK. A lot of the rest is using resistive electrical heating. So here in Scotland, there's a lot of storage heating, for example, that's taking power from the electricity network that is supplied in part by perhaps gas turbines that are burning the same natural gas. And of course, there's other things in the system as well. But the other option we have is that we can use electricity and put that through heat pumps instead. And if we kind of stick some efficiency numbers on each of those, then we can see that this key number down here, this heat pump coefficient of performance, you're putting in a certain amount of energy and you're getting a lot more out. I mean, there's a fairly broad range of uncertainties on what you're going to get out, but it's a pretty substantial number. And if we do that comparison between heat pumps and natural gas through gas boilers, then essentially you're getting, energetically, you're doing a lot better with a heat pump, but that's counterbalanced by the cheapness of natural gas in itself. But if we look to the future where we're having potentially a very high proportion of renewables in the system, and we can't carry on burning natural gas, then the question becomes then of the balance between, do we use that electricity directly in heat pumps, or do we electrolyze it into hydrogen and then continue through the gas system as before? And again, with these kind of efficiencies that we can put in, we can see pretty clearly that the energetically optimal pathway is still going to be through heat pumps. This number here dominates everything. Whereas if we're going through the hydrogen route, the electrolyzer makes losses and we have further losses when we actually burn the gas. So there's a lot of very complex system models out there that really come down to this same fundamental issue. If you can get the energy through a heat pump in any way possible, then you want to do that because that coefficient of performance outweighs any other consideration. And it doesn't really matter how much spatial or temporal detail you try and put on this, that's still going to be the fundamental result. If you can use a heat pump, then you should. Of course, there are issues that prevent this. So there's huge variability in heat demand, there's huge variability in renewable production. The two are only very loosely correlated. So there's a huge need to some way provide flexibility that can balance those two. But if that's just a question of building more network costs are a fairly small part of the entire economic picture. So still we come out with heat pumps. So the question then becomes not what the technical and economic optimum is, but how many people can we get using heat pumps? And these are things that these kind of models don't represent very well. We have all kinds of issues. So there is the capital cost of heat pumps. We're trying to persuade people who are used to spending maybe £2,000 on a gas boiler to spend 3 or 4 times that on the equivalent capacity of heat pumps. And the incentives that are coming along help that and financing, but it's still a very big ask to get people to make that transition. There's also the fact that gas boilers are incredibly convenient. People have got used to combi gas boilers. They take up very small amounts of space in the home. They're relatively quiet. They give heat to both types of demand whenever it's needed. And people are going to be very hard to persuade to get away from that picture. And then there's the building stock. So what can we actually do? Jan showed his house. I would love to do similar, but I'm sitting in a tenement flat in Glasgow. There's absolutely no opportunity for me to fit a heat pump, no matter how willing I am or what financial means I have to do so. And so I'm kind of stuck here. I've spoken to a housing association about heat network potential. They've never even really heard of these things. So there's a question over how much building stock can we really do this in, and how willing are people to do this? We also make some fairly big assumptions about heat demand and what people use. And we have to be careful that when we're doing this kind of modeling, that we don't just assume that heat demand is fixed. So there's a study we did where we looked at the variability and the different nature of heat demand around the country. And this is a graph showing the marginal abatement cost of installing heat pumps into houses around the country. So basically, as your household heat demand gets bigger, the marginal abatement cost, so the cost of reducing carbon, gets lower and lower because you're spreading out the capital cost of installing the heat pumps. And this shows that small houses that are currently using electric heating should probably not go for heat pumps and then carry on with resistive electrical heating, and houses that are currently using gas should be installing heat pumps because it gives a negative abatement cost potentially. However, this ignores the fact that the huge amount of these small households with electric heaters are underheating their homes. And if you compare like for like and normalize for different housing size, social, economic demographics, actually there is likely to be a huge upshift in the level of heat demand from these smaller households. If you give these people access to cheaper heating through, for example, heat pumps, then their heat demand will probably shift significantly upwards. And our work here demonstrates that that could be as much as a doubling of heat demand in smaller households. So we can't assume that what people currently demand in heat is what they will have as demand in the future. And this has implications for the size of national emissions reduction we actually achieve, because there's potentially a huge rebound as we decarbonize. There's also the issue of how space heating compares to other demands for energy. So a study we did looked at a few areas, but in this particular example, a neighborhood in Darlington. So this is kind of 1930s semi-detached, quite low efficiency housing. And we simulated occupants within these homes, switching on and off devices at different times based on survey data. And this diversity factor, this is the ratio between the peak demand for energy and across all the households and the individual peaks. So basically a smaller number means that people are doing things at different times, and you have more potential to spread out that load and reduce total peak for the system. And this line kind of indicates what that curve looks like as you have more and more households for normal electricity use. Hot water demand is good because people use hot water for very short periods of time at very different points in time, so turn showers on and off at different times. So there's lots of potential to shift demand for hot water just by putting in a very small amount of storage, as we commonly have in many homes. Space heating, on the other hand, does not have this potential, because generally people will have in the same area their heating on at the same time. And those homes will be full of people who are living in very similar ways and undergoing the same external temperature conditions. So the opportunity to actually be flexible with space heating is very minimal compared to other forms of demand. It can be quite hard to kind of visualize what this means in terms of flexibility. So if we try and visualize this, this is an indicator that if we wanted all the flexibility that was needed to supply heat demand in homes contained within those buildings themselves, so in this case, looking at integrating that storage into the fabric of the home, this indicates how much of different types of homes would need to be occupied by that storage material. So it's quite hard to see this in the diagram, but that grey outer block is if it was concrete, the blue is if it was water, green if it was a wax-based solution, and red if it was magnetite blocks that are very expensive. So this is a kind of daily shift that would be needed. So this looks something like what you'd have in terms of normal electrical storage heaters. If you're getting to weekly volumes, which is where we would probably want to be if we're looking at a very wind-driven system, then essentially you're looking at taking over a substantial proportion of people's homes to meet that storage requirement. And if we're looking at seasonal storage, then we're eclipsing homes altogether. And really the only kind of seasonal storage that's viable would be hydrogen in salt caverns. So of course, this storage doesn't have to exist entirely within homes, but this just gives a good visualization of the level of flexibility that we're going to need within the system if we're looking at a very electrically dominated heat pump based future. So just as my last slide, Jan brought up a part of this beforehand, but as we've shifted from having an 80% emissions target to a net zero target, this has drastically changed the ambition of the residential sector. We've gone from a fairly modest reduction in residential emissions to basically saying we have to remove all residential sector emissions. And this is a problem because it means bringing everybody along. All these people who are utterly unaware that there's any issue whatsoever with household emissions have to be part of this picture, have to be persuaded to shift the technologies that they're using. And we see through this work that there isn't this dichotomy between hydrogen and electrification. Both are going to be needed. Under all scenarios, we see that there's a future for hydrogen, even though economics drives us towards the heat pump solution. Really, the question is the scale at which that hydrogen system and gas system persists. And we see that there would be almost certainly a regional decarbonisation of gas networks, so distribution networks. The question really is whether we still need a national gas system if we're no longer trying to extract all the resource from the North Sea. And heat networks, as has already been said, give us a lot of potential flexibility to bridge through to these long-term transitions. I'll stop there, so thank you very much.